Welcome to the Spool podcast. Unwind with Dr. Nils Roemer, Dean of the Bass School at UT Dallas.
Thank you for joining us today here on our podcast. Professor Mitchell, you have had a long and very distinguished career at the University of Chicago, where you both worked as a professor in the English department and as a professor in art history, which already says something about you that normally professors are in either one or the other. But by doing that, you really created a canon of critical work that investigated particularly the meaning of images in their kind of textual meaning, but also in their kind of situation within our culture. We had the good fortune of listening to you, in particular thinking about games. In those games, you largely try to kind of think about it within the context of the creation of a space, the perception of that space, and the kind of lived experience of it, of sorts. And so maybe if we can spin on that a little bit further, there's probably something to be said that, you know, with these games in particular, if we can think about them in terms of spaces, right? That's where you were leading us. And then if we could think about them in terms of spaces with all the other possibilities that spaces have in terms of occupying, you know, placing ourselves, holding the spaces. So is that for you like a possibility that games are in certain ways spaces that we can kind of enter into and occupy and kind of do what we like to do?
Yes, we can, but sometimes we find ourselves in games where we're doing things we don't like. We are absorbed into a way of doing things that is a kind of game with maybe hidden rules or explicit rules, and one of the points is to try to escape those spaces.
That's why I think your example yesterday that you shared with us was chessboard, right? Everything is out in the open, and there are no hidden rules. Everything is out there. But it did, you know, I think you had some wonderful examples, you know, to make us think about landscape and spaces. And I think one of the thoughts that I had about that was the extent to which, I mean, you used as one of the examples, one of my predictable favorite artists, the German one, the Caspar David Friedrich.
Yes.
It's kind of the romantic landscape art that, however, at the time was, you know, as it often was said, celebrated or abhorred because it had this kind of no boundaries of sorts, right? And one of the kind of startling realizations about that art is, you know, as you're looking at it, there was nothing for you to hold on to, and therefore it had quasi, could we say, an immersive quality of sorts, like something that we associate more often with games, that we're actually drawn into this, right?
Yes, and I felt like one of the things about Monk by the Sea, that great Friedrich painting, is the way it shows a kind of endgame. I connected it to Mary Shelley's novel, The Last Man, which was a contemporary painting by John Martin, shows a single survivor at the end of the world looking at the infinity of the empty world. So the idea of the end game, you know, how does a game come to an end?
And what rules are, you know, then kind of applying. I mean, again, that was the chess reference, right? That we, you know, when it comes to the end game,
right,
you know, that's played out in different ways.
Sometimes you're down to one pawn.
That's right. But before we get all despairing and think about end game, I mean, there's another way of thinking about that very painting, and that is that it actually also draws our attention to the fact that nature exists out there without us, right? And so that's the other thing that, you know, these days, I think Caspar David Friedrich, I should get his German name right?
Yes.
I think we just had its 250th anniversary or something like that. And so we have these, you know, big exhibits. And what's interesting, he's reclaimed as a, you know, in kind of in light of our thoughts about the environment right now, as someone who's in those paintings, possibly drawing our attention to the end game, but also possibly just drawing our attention to the kind of beauty that nature is onto itself without us.
Yes.
And also a bit in the throes of that being actually overwhelming for us, to be in spaces where there's no orientation. And then again, that was the beautiful other examples that you had was the landscape paintings with the serpentine, right?
Yes.
Where there's orientation, but not so much in his paintings, right? There's nothing.
Right. Yeah, I think Friedrich also, there's a more positive message rather than the end game. You can look at that solitary figure beholding the abyss of nature as he's tiny against the landscape. But with the blink of an eye, you can look at it quite differently and say, but he sees it. He is there. He's conscious of it. And there is no other creature who is conscious of the infinite the way the human creature is. So in that way, it's a kind of humanistic allegory. We are tiny, the universe is enormous, but we're the ones who understand that.
And can behold, you know, and kind of realize that beauty, and also thereby kind of can figure out something about ourselves. I mean, that's the other part, you know, if one thinks about the games, the spaces, then, you know, in a way one could say, well, part of our challenge right now is that we have to figure out a little bit who we are respectively.
Exactly.
But then, and related to that, what our futures are, you know, and I think that's where games, I mean, you talked about the gamification of our time that often is celebrated now as the kind of new paradigm that replaces actually the age of information. That's more tied to our bookish culture, right? The Enlightenment, the encyclopedias. But how is this going to change us? I mean, in passing yesterday, you think said something about movie industry as having changed our subjectivity.
Yes, well, as you know, the Frankfurt School,
exactly,
and Walter Benjamin in particular, said that cinema had produced a new mode of perception, that instead of the kind of elite culture of literature, poetry, novels, and so forth, people were gathering in mass audiences, and they were consuming stories, information, pictures in a state of distraction instead of concentration. And to his credit, I think Benjamin didn't condemn that. He said, this is something we need to understand. What is the new mode of perception that goes with cinema? The same thing now with games.
No, exactly. So this is maybe where we can draw the parallels, that in a way we can kind of look at this from a wider perspective, and we could say, well, any kind of larger technological change has also resulted in the kind of reconfiguration of our cultures, but also often our sense of ourselves. I mean, we talked about the Enlightenment, the kind of production of small novels that you could kind of have in your pocket, just like we do nowadays our iPhone. That was an escape pocket of sorts, right? You could just pull it out, you could read it, and you can enter their world. But then interestingly, if you read like whatever the sufferings of the young Werther or whatever it was, sorry with my German examples, but what is interesting about them is that then all these young adolescent young men felt profoundly like what they've just read. In other words, the boundary between fiction and their life entirely blurred. And I think it blurred in a different way again with radio, or it blurred in a different way maybe with movies. But I think it is also blurring now very much, where I think games, or what we call the gamification, is not simply in there any longer, but it really, are we at the point that it also is going to define us or shape us in different ways? That's my question.
I think so. I think it is a genuinely new medium, and that along with the internet, gamification, and streaming video, online communication, it's transforming the entire social structure.
I think so as well. I mean, you drew yesterday also on one of the often cited examples, Minecraft. And I remember I have 4 boys at home. They're all in the same age. When Minecraft came about, they were gone. But there was no real separation between, they were in their respective rooms, but then they were connected playing Minecraft. And so there was no separation between their real world and their game world. It was all one. And they were collaborating in there and out there, and they were drawing in friends. And I think that's our sense sometimes about technology as something that's out there, and we are here, is I think becoming more and more challenging in light of the new technology that we're changing. But you and I confessed our admiration of the Frankfurt School earlier when I had a chance to talk to you. are we again at a point where, in order to make sense out of that, we cannot rely on any kind of pre-existing explanations? I mean, that's to my mind sometimes why, you were the editor of Critical Inquiry, which is a journal dedicated to critical theory. Why so much of the critical theory remains relevant? Because historically they were on these edges of these other times that really couldn't quite figure out, and they were blending psychology and market analysis or art and politics in ways to make sense of something that seemed really hard to come to terms with. So are we again, I know you've also worked quite a bit on time, right, in our moment in time.
Yes.
Are we again in one of these kind of weird moments in time where we don't have that certainty that we have something that we can fall back on that explains who we are and where we go?
Yeah, I think we definitely are. It's particularly in the United States, it's a really decisive and monumental event, a moment when our politics, the sense of what our nation is for, what the American dream is, all of that is being challenged, disrupted very radically. And technology is certainly part of that, but it's a convergence of technology and politics. I mean, podcasts like this are now part of the common source of communication, social sharing of knowledge. This was inconceivable a few years ago.
Very true, but one could argue that the kind of convergence of politics and radicalizing politics would have been also a mark of the 1920s and 1930s, right?
Yes.
That, I mean, this is like what Benjamin is so kind of fixated on,
Yeah.
understanding the kind of convergence really of these different types of forces. But yesterday you were like, I think always just like, you know, when we talked about the Caspar David Friedrich, you said endgame, and then I said, well, isn't there hopefulness? And then you're saying yes. And so yesterday, I think you were also kind of leaning on your left, leaning on the right, because there were also moments where you said that you attributed also associated great hope with AI, right? As being a way to, quote unquote, play ourselves out of our impasses of sorts right now, because we may be just also short in tenable solutions right now, and not just simply confronted with politics. So can we explore that hopeful side? Because yesterday I think you didn't quite get into that as much.
Okay, well, let me say what I think the hopeful side of AI is. Everybody recognizes, and I think rightly, that it can be very dangerous in circulating disinformation, misinformation, fabricating alternate realities. But we already know how powerful it is in medicine. For instance, an AI can analyze a patient's chart and come up with an accurate diagnosis much more quickly than the average physician. So there's a lot of positive things about it. But I look at it, I'm not a technophile. I don't immerse myself in, I can't write code or design these things. I look at AI from the standpoint of the history of science fiction, which has, one of the central narratives of science fiction is the question of other minds, other forms of intelligence. For 100 years or more, we have been imagining that aliens, intelligent aliens superior to us, would arrive from outer space.
Just looking at the audience, making sure that none of them are here, you know?
Yes, I don't see any here with us. But
right.
Of course, they could be in disguise.
They could be, who knows?
You never know. In any case, what if the aliens came and they weren't coming as invaders, but they were coming to help?
Right.
They were coming to say, you know, you as a species are an endangered species. You're in trouble. And so we have arrived. We haven't come from outer space, though. We've come from inner space. You invented us. We came out of your minds, and now we need to be friends.
You know, we had just a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed an individual, one of our alums, David Hansen, and he was very much expanding upon those lines that AI is, in the end, our creation, and our AI will become whatever it is that we will shape, and it could very well be that it becomes our companion and can be our friend of sorts, and I think we see elements of that as well in the creation of chatbots that become our companion, and we can talk to them, and they kind of evolve along with us.
They can even be our therapists.
They can be our therapists. That's right. They can, do that while they're suggesting good recipes for a nice dinner at night, and tell you about any sports team that hopefully has won lately, or or will win again, or whatever it is. So there's a lot of hope in this as well.
Yeah.
But I think the premise of sorts in all of this is, I guess, that we are really in need of new answers. That you had this wonderful. I'm still going to have to look this up. You had this great example where you wanted to talk about the kind of convergence of politics and game, and you had this great edging of the tennis court. Do you mind describe? You describe this better than I do. I just saw it briefly, but brilliant example.
Yeah, it's a print from the workshop of the great French artist David, and it's called The Tennis Court Oath. And it is a picture of an actual historic event in 1789 when the Third Estate, the bourgeoisie of France, they swore an oath not to dissolve the parliament until they had a constitution, because it was clear that monarchy was no longer going to work. In fact, they were in danger. The monarch was sending, Louis XIV was sending troops to dissolve them. So they resolved not to dissolve and to write their constitution and begin the first French Republic.
But it's, in other words, this moment where you kind of leaned a little bit into that, where it opened the door to think about, okay, was it coincidental that it took place on a tennis court, or is there maybe more that we can extract from that, and that is the idea that gaming will be maybe possibly become that place where we can, some say, play out alternative or more desirable futures than the ones that seem to just be a repeat of what has happened. So that's what I thought was so beautiful, kind of coming together.
Well, I think one thing it suggests is probably just it was convenient, and it was sort of an accident. This could have happened anywhere, but it also shows a moment when the Parliament didn't have a place to meet, and so they chose the tennis court. It sticks in our mind. It's always called the tennis court oath, and but what does it have to do with the actual game of tennis? Nothing. It was as if an old game was suddenly repurposed. It became the site of one of the great democratic revolutions in human history.
So let's game on. Let's see what happens. We're going to do it in different spaces, right? In these more virtual spaces, maybe, where some of this can occur. But I just thought it was like a striking example of sorts of where maybe gaming could take us.
Right, and game can take us into things we don't expect at the beginning, like the whole genre of the point and shoot game.
Right.
I thought the September 12th game, which shows up the futility of the point and shoot game itself. So you play this game for 5 minutes, you keep bombing suspected terrorists, and every time you kill one, 10 arise to replace it. So the game is teaching you, don't play this game.
Right.
This is not the kind of game you want.
But it's also, moving away maybe from that particular game, we talked earlier about Minecraft, it's also the extent to which do games still have to wrap around a narrative arc? In other words, do they have to be built like a protagonist who overcomes obstacles and then kind of gets there? Or is it also our gaming culture reflective now of kind of our end of narratives of sorts that doesn't necessarily, Minecraft is, at least my boys, they were gone for days and days. They were never reaching any conclusions. They enjoyed the process. This was not outcome driven or as much any longer.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to remember that there, in addition to the concept of the game and gamification, there's a thing that human beings have always done, which is to play.
That's right.
And play is, in general, a form of pleasure, of acceptance of accident, of randomness, of chance. And this is why, at the end, during the discussion, somebody asked me if I had an example of a sort of purposeless game that I felt was promising. And I said, yes, it's a world-building game, but it's called the art of sandcastle building.
Oh, that's right. You were, telling us about how accomplished of a sandcastle builder indeed you are, right?
I'm extremely skillful at this game, which has no purpose except the immediate pleasure of a summer day at the beach and playing with children in the sand and passing on skills that, you don't just have to use a Dixie cup and make a tower. You can make a really big tower, and I'll show you how.
But I remember that conversation, and there's a name that popped into my mind when you were talking about it, Huizinga. The whole idea of play as a form of culture formation. But I mean, one of the criteria that Huizinga stipulates for play to be play is that it is not driven by purpose, right? That it's kind of this effortless kind of engagement of pleasure. But with all that, he does associate positive outcomes, right? I mean, for Huizinga, play is one of the driving forces that also creates culture. So maybe sandcastles. So that's maybe the way to go. That, we're trying always to come up here with some plausible solutions to our dilemmas that we're facing. I'm anyway in favor of summer vacation.
I hope it's
so that solves a lot of my problems. If I, while I'm at it, if I'm now feel even more purposely driven to build some sandcastles, I think I'll take that as my summer assignment.
I hope this won't be a scandal for you when they release this podcast and they say, "Oh, University of Texas at Dallas they're promoting sandcastle building now."
Higher education. I mean, we could say that higher education has very little to do with play these days. It's not really a game. It's very very outcome driven. The way we built this has been really designed for us to have measurable outcomes that in lots of ways result in a curriculum that we can move students through. Is there maybe a need for us to reassert that the university higher education ought to be a place of gaming?
Well, I think it is a place of gaming, and actually, again, to come back to the distinction between gaming and playing, I think it's equally important for universities to be places of play. And certainly when it comes to sports, or in the case of UT Dallas, chess.
Chess, that's right.
These, you play chess, it is a game. Here, it's a very serious game. And there you are cultivate champions. So that relation between the free play of the faculties, doing things which may seem purposeless but are pleasurable, instructive, that create a balanced self, that promote, we talk about the pursuit of happiness. I can't imagine a happy society that can't play. Music, art, all of the liberal arts, storytelling. So to me, play is essential to the idea that we could use games in a way that does not just lead to an end game.
But there is some kind of association. I mean, going back to Huizinga, in other words, that play at some point or another more serendipitously can lead to discovery and learning or something like that, right? But that we may have to go back again into allowing that more and building into curriculum the assignment play, right?
Yes, yeah.
With the hope that good things come from it instead of just constantly loading everything with prefigured assignments.
One of my experiments with artificial intelligence has been to not to forbid students to use AI in writing their papers. I gave them an assignment in which they had to take lines, Proverbs of Hell from William Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and ask.
I have a fine reading list. You pick like some really nice pieces,
yeah.
you know?
So they take AI and they ask ChatGPT, write an interpretation of this proverb: the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. AI comes back with a perfectly plausible interpretation. It's smart. It's got, would get a B+.
Right.
And then I say, okay, and now when you have that, write a critique of it. Can you be smarter? Can you question its assumptions? How are you going to engage with this feedback from a mechanical intelligence? And of course, my students are very competitive. They instantly said, yes, we're going to show you, Professor Mitchell, we can be smarter than this machine. And they did.
No, that's maybe a way to think about it, that it's not really there for us to produce something on our behalf, but rather to help us do what we're doing, but better.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting part also of AI. You know, we're doing a podcast, and so these days you can go into Google Notebook and you can load it with any number of text, and then you hit the button produce, and then it produces by itself this what's called deep dive. And they're astonishingly good. I mean, with real voices, there's conversation. But the one thing that they never do is they never argue. There's never dissent. There's never like excitement or any of that. It's just.
I think you can program them to argue.
Right
and
now they're a friendly bunch.
There's a unit at Stanford, I can't remember the name of it, but it's within their artificial intelligence labs, that is designed to do fact-checking. And I think this is one of the most powerful uses that could be made of AI. Identifying lies, identifying misinformation, because in principle, they have the facts at their disposal. They have all the databases. So if somebody says the moon is made of green cheese, AI could say, I'm sorry,
probably
folks,
not.
Here's what the moon is actually made of.
Could look like orange cheese once in a while. Like, you could get away with that one maybe more easily. Don't be green. Okay, maybe just as a way of wrapping it up, I think you very famously became so engaged with the importance of images. And by doing that, you almost attributed, subjectivity to images and their desires and what they want. Is it the same with games?
It's a good question. I think games are.
What do games want would be a paraphrasing your question, right?
I think they want to be played. They want attention and engagement, and this is why I think, unfortunately, the point-and-shoot game, the kind of game of destroying your enemy, has become so dominant, because the algorithms that underlie games are designed for attention and engagement. They can measure the response. How many people are logging in? How many people are playing? And if the number is low, then they ask themselves, how can we increase that? And one answer is lots of violent images. They attract attention.
But that says presumably something maybe about the games, but unfortunately says a lot about us.
Yeah.
And I think it's maybe the us that is as much the problem here as maybe the games.
Oh, we are definitely the problem.
So I think that's maybe the other, I think there's this very easy kind of conversation these days. Is like, where will all this lead with the games, this and that, and I think the real question is where does it all lead with the us, and I think I think a really, interesting question for, that I kind of return to over and over these days is, where respectively are we in this story? And yesterday I joked around with you when you actually very seriously and made a really, really important point about the dinosaurs. You remember?
Yes.
About how they actually were not too silly to survive, but they hung in there quite a while, right?
Oh, they did. They were had amazing longevity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I was joking around a little bit with you about that. But where are we, respectively, in our arc now as it's kind of humanity? Are we on the ascend? Are we on the descend? Or as a society? Or, or just a smaller generation? Or where we are in our story about higher education again?
Well, I always recall that line from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. And the problem of the humanities, and this is why I think the humanities is more crucial than ever. Some people think, oh, the humanities, that's the past. Technology is the future. But technology without the humanities, put it simply, is going to have no soul. We need to have humanities to ask, what games are we playing? Why? Where do they lead us? And how can we find games that ensure that we are evolving intelligently? That is, we're guaranteeing our survival, our overcoming of the many problems we've created for ourselves. So the humanities is the discipline that asks, what are we?
And I think that's, for good or bad, a question that as humans we've always asked, and we're going to continue to ask, and we're just hopeful that we're going to come up with some clever answers. I think we need them more than ever.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.